My name is Sarah, and I've been the head nurse in the transplant ICU at Metropolitan General for 15 years. In those 15 years, I've seen miracles happen on operating tables, watched families cry tears of joy when death sentences became second chances, and I've also seen the ugly side of medicine that most people never witness. The corruption, the politics, the God complexes that turn brilliant surgeons into monsters who believe they're above the very oath they swore to uphold. This is the story of how I brought down one of those monsters, and why sometimes you have to let a tragedy happen to expose an even greater evil. It started on a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of morning where the transplant ward felt more like a battlefield than a place of healing. We had 2 patients on the liver transplant list, both critical, both running out of time. The first was Marcus Thompson, a 42-year-old construction worker from Queens, father of 3, husband to Maria, who hadn't left his bedside in 2 weeks. Marcus had been waiting 8 months for a compatible liver, watching his body slowly shut down from end-stage liver disease caused by a genetic condition he never saw coming. His MELD score was 28, putting him at the top of our priority list. The man was dying, and we all knew it. His yellowish skin told the story his lab results confirmed every morning. His liver was failing, and without a transplant, he had maybe 2 weeks left. Then there was our other patient, Richard Blackstone, the 73-year-old real estate mogul whose name appeared on buildings across Manhattan. Blackstone had been admitted 3 days ago with acute liver failure, though his was self-inflicted. Decades of premium whiskey and cocaine had finally caught up with him. His MELD score was only 18, which should have put him well below Marcus on the waiting list. But Blackstone had something Marcus didn't have: a $50 million donation to Metropolitan General's new cardiac wing, and the kind of connections that made hospital administrators nervous when he called. I'd watched Blackstone's team of private doctors consult with our transplant chief, Dr. Evelyn Ashford, behind closed doors, more times than I could count in just 3 days. Dr. Evelyn Ashford was everything you'd expect from a world-renowned transplant surgeon, and everything you'd fear from someone who'd forgotten why they became a doctor in the first place. At 51, she had performed over 2,000 liver transplants, had been featured on the cover of Medical Journal International 3 times, and had a success rate that made other surgeons weep with envy. The hospital treated her like a deity, and she had begun to believe her own mythology. Ashford walked through our ICU like she owned it, because in many ways she did. Her department brought in over $40 million in revenue annually, and that kind of money bought a lot of immunity from oversight. I'd seen her bend rules before, manipulate waiting lists for wealthy patients, but I'd never been able to prove it. The woman was careful, calculated, and surrounded by a wall of administrators who protected her like she was their golden goose, which frankly, she was. The tension in our ward that week was suffocating. Marcus's wife Maria had started sleeping in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand and whispering prayers in Spanish while his children did homework in the family lounge, trying to stay strong for their father. Meanwhile, Blackstone held court in his private room like he was conducting business, taking calls about real estate deals while his private security detail made everyone uncomfortable. The contrast was stark and heartbreaking. One man facing death with dignity and family love, another treating his liver failure like a minor inconvenience that money could fix. I've learned to read the signs in this business, the subtle shifts in behavior that tell you when something unethical is about to happen. I noticed how Dr. Ashford's visits to Blackstone's room had become more frequent, how she would emerge from those meetings looking satisfied in a way that made my stomach turn. I saw how she avoided eye contact with Marcus's family, how she had started delegating his care to residents while personally overseeing every aspect of Blackstone's treatment. The writing was on the wall, but I couldn't prove anything yet. That's when Dr. Ben Carter entered the picture. Carter was a third-year internal medicine resident doing his transplant surgery rotation, 28 years old, fresh-faced, and still naive enough to believe that medicine was about saving lives rather than generating revenue. He idolized Dr. Ashford the way young doctors often idolize legends, studying her techniques, memorizing her published papers, and dreaming of achieving her level of surgical mastery someday. Carter had been assigned to monitor the organ procurement network, meaning he was responsible for reviewing donor compatibility reports and ensuring all medical criteria were met before organs were harvested and transported. It was supposed to be routine work for a resident, the kind of administrative duty that kept them busy while they learned the ropes. On that Tuesday evening, around 7 p.m., the call came in. A donor had been found. A 24-year-old motorcycle accident victim from New Jersey, whose family had made the difficult decision to donate his organs. The initial compatibility screening looked promising for Marcus Thompson, and for the first time in weeks, I saw hope flicker in Maria's eyes when I gave them the preliminary news. "They found one?" she whispered, gripping Marcus's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "They found a liver for him?" I told her what I always told families at this stage, that we needed to run final compatibility tests, that nothing was guaranteed until the surgery was complete. But yes, it looked promising. Marcus managed a weak smile, the first I'd seen from him in days. Dr. Carter was tasked with reviewing the final donor reports that came in around 9 p.m. This was standard protocol. A resident would review all the lab work, medical history, and compatibility markers to ensure the organ was safe for transplant. Carter took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps more seriously than most residents, because he understood that lives hung in the balance of his thoroughness. He logged into the hospital's donor network system, pulled up the case file, and began methodically reviewing each test result, each piece of medical history, each compatibility marker that would determine whether this organ could save Marcus Thompson's life. What Carter found in those reports would haunt him forever. Buried in the donor's blood work, clearly marked and unmistakable, was a positive result for hepatitis C. The donor had an active hepatitis C infection, making his liver completely unsuitable for transplant. Any surgeon who used that organ would be knowingly infecting the recipient with a potentially fatal disease. Carter stared at his computer screen in disbelief, double-checking the results, hoping he had misread something. But there it was, clear as day. Hepatitis C positive. The donor's liver was contaminated and absolutely could not be used for transplant. Carter immediately did what any responsible medical professional would do. He prepared to alert the transplant team that the organ was unsuitable. But as he was printing the reports to take to Dr. Ashford, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The system showed that Dr. Ashford had accessed the same donor file just minutes before him. She had seen the exact same reports, the exact same hepatitis C positive result. She knew the liver was contaminated, and yet she hadn't canceled the procurement. The organ was still being transported to Metropolitan General. The operating room was still being prepared, and Marcus Thompson was still being prepped for surgery. Carter refreshed his browser, thinking perhaps there had been some kind of system error. When the page reloaded, his worst fears were confirmed. The hepatitis C positive result had been removed from the report. Someone with administrative access had deleted the test result from the official record. The donor file now showed clean blood work, perfect compatibility markers, and absolutely no indication that the liver was infected with hepatitis C. Carter sat at his workstation, staring at his computer screen, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. A world-renowned surgeon had just falsified medical records to hide the fact that she was about to knowingly infect a patient with hepatitis C. The implications hit Carter like a physical blow. Dr. Ashford wasn't just bending rules or manipulating waiting lists. She was about to commit what amounted to attempted murder. She was going to give Marcus Thompson a diseased liver that would kill him, and she was doing it to keep a healthy organ available for Richard Blackstone. The mathematics of medical corruption had never been starker. Let the poor man die from a contaminated organ so the rich man could have a clean one. Carter printed the original report before the alteration, his hands shaking as he realized he was holding evidence of a crime that was about to be committed. But Carter faced an impossible situation. The organ transport was already in progress. The operating room was prepared. Marcus Thompson was being sedated for surgery, and Dr. Ashford was scrubbing in, even if he ran to the OR immediately. Would anyone believe a third-year resident over the legendary Dr. Evelyn Ashford? Would they stop a surgery based on his word alone? And if they did believe him, what would happen to Marcus Thompson, who would die without a transplant within days? Carter realized that he was witnessing a crime in progress and was powerless to stop it. That's when he came to me. Carter burst into the nurse's station around 10:30 p.m., his face pale and his hands trembling. I could see the moral crisis written across his features, the look of someone whose faith in the medical profession had just been shattered. He pulled me aside, away from the other nurses, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that would change everything. She knew the donor had hepatitis. Sarah, Dr. Ashford, knew the donor had hepatitis C, and she deleted the test results. She's about to kill Marcus Thompson to save a clean liver for Blackstone. I stared at Carter for a long moment, letting his words sink in. In 15 years of nursing, I thought I'd seen every form of medical malpractice, every corruption the healthcare system could produce. But this was different. This was premeditated, calculated murder disguised as life-saving surgery. I asked Carter to show me the evidence, and he handed me the printed report, with the original hepatitis C-positive result. The timestamp showed that Dr. Ashford had accessed the file 4 minutes before the result disappeared from the system. She had seen the contamination, made a conscious decision to hide it, and was proceeding with the surgery anyway. The cold fury that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I wasn't angry. Anger was too hot, too emotional for what I was feeling. This was something colder, more calculated. I looked at Carter and said, "We can't stop this surgery. It's too late for that, but we can make sure she never kills anyone else." Carter stared at me, not understanding what I meant. "What are you talking about, Sarah? We have to try to stop this. We have to tell someone." I shook my head. "Tell who? Hospital administration? They're in Blackstone's pocket. The surgical chief? He worships Ashford. Medical ethics board? By the time they investigate, Marcus will be dead, and the evidence will be buried." I explained to Carter the brutal mathematics of our situation. Dr. Ashford had just committed the perfect crime. If Marcus Thompson died from the contaminated liver, she would simply list the cause of death as organ rejection, a common complication that no one would question. The original donor reports showing hepatitis C had been deleted from the system, so there would be no digital trail. The only evidence was the printed report Carter held, which could easily be dismissed as a fabrication by a disgruntled resident. Ashford would walk away clean, Blackstone would get his healthy liver, and the hospital would collect its $50 million donation. The system was designed to protect people like her, but I had a different plan, one that required patience, documentation, and the willingness to watch an innocent man die, so we could save countless others. I told Carter that we weren't going to try to stop the surgery because we couldn't. Instead, we were going to document everything, collect irrefutable evidence, and prepare for war. "We're going to let her commit this murder," I said, watching Carter's eyes widen in horror. "And then, we're going to use it to destroy her completely." The surgery began at 11:15 p.m. I watched Dr. Ashford enter the OR with her usual confidence, her God complex fully intact. She had no idea that 2 floors above her, Carter and I were beginning the most important documentation project of our careers. I instructed Carter to make multiple copies of the original donor report, storing them in different locations, including a secure cloud storage account that couldn't be accessed by hospital administrators. I began creating a detailed timeline of every interaction between Dr. Ashford and Richard Blackstone, every private meeting, every consultation that had occurred outside normal protocols. While Marcus Thompson's chest was being opened in operating room 3, I was in the ICU collecting evidence that would eventually send his surgeon to prison. I photographed the original consultation notes that showed Blackstone's lower MELD score, documenting how he had jumped ahead of Marcus on the waiting list, despite being less critical. I copied the financial records showing Blackstone's donation to the hospital, establishing the motive for preferential treatment. Most importantly, I began documenting Marcus's medical condition with obsessive detail, creating a baseline that would make it impossible to hide what the contaminated liver would do to him. Carter and I worked through the night, building a case that would be absolutely irrefutable when the time came to present it. We knew that Dr. Ashford would try to cover her tracks, would manipulate medical records and buy silence from colleagues, so we had to be thorough enough to overcome any defense she might mount. Every conversation was recorded when legally possible. Every document was copied and stored securely. Every witness statement was carefully preserved. We were building a monument to Marcus Thompson's murder, one that would stand long after Ashford thought she had buried the evidence. The surgery lasted 4 hours. Dr. Ashford emerged from the OR at 3:20 a.m., looking satisfied and tired. She updated Marcus's family with the standard post-transplant speech about cautious optimism, careful monitoring, and the long road to recovery. Maria Thompson cried tears of relief, thanking God and Dr. Ashford for saving her husband's life. Marcus's children hugged each other in the family lounge, finally able to smile for the first time in months. None of them knew that their husband and father had just been given a death sentence disguised as a miracle. I watched Dr. Ashford deliver that update to the Thompson family, and I had to leave the room before I said something that would compromise our investigation. The casual cruelty of giving false hope to a family that had suffered so much was almost more than I could bear. But I reminded myself that their pain would not be meaningless if we could use it to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Marcus Thompson was going to die, but his death would save lives if we played this correctly. The immediate post-operative period proceeded normally. Marcus was moved to the transplant ICU, where I personally took charge of his care. I documented every vital sign, every lab result, every medication given, creating a medical record so detailed that no one could later claim his deterioration was unexpected or unpreventable. Dr. Ashford made her rounds, adjusting medications and monitoring progress, playing the role of the concerned surgeon while secretly knowing she had just infected her patient with a potentially fatal disease. For the first week, Marcus actually seemed to improve. The new liver began producing bile. His bilirubin levels started to normalize, and his energy returned slightly. Maria was ecstatic, telling everyone who would listen about the miracle Dr. Ashford had performed. The other nurses commented on how well Marcus was doing compared to many transplant patients, and even Dr. Ashford seemed genuinely pleased with his progress. For a brief moment, I wondered if somehow we had been wrong, if the hepatitis C result had been a false positive, if Marcus might actually survive. But by the second week, the signs began to appear. Marcus's energy levels started dropping again. His appetite disappeared, and his lab results began showing subtle abnormalities that I recognized, but others dismissed as normal post-transplant fluctuations. His liver enzymes were climbing, his bilirubin was creeping upward, and most tellingly, his viral load tests were showing the presence of hepatitis C in his bloodstream. The contaminated liver was doing exactly what Carter and I knew it would do. It was killing Marcus Thompson slowly and methodically. I documented every symptom, every test result, every sign that Marcus's new liver was infected and failing. Dr. Ashford continued her rounds, adjusting medications and ordering additional tests. But I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what was happening. She was watching her victim die from the disease she had knowingly given him, and she was prepared to let it happen rather than confess what she had done. The clinical detachment with which she observed Marcus's deterioration was perhaps the most chilling thing I'd ever witnessed in my career. Maria Thompson began to notice the changes too. He seemed to be getting better, she told me during one of our conversations. But now he looks tired again, and he's not eating. Is this normal? Dr. Ashford says it's just part of the recovery process, but I'm scared. I had to look this woman in the eye, knowing her husband was dying from medical murder, and give her false reassurance while secretly documenting evidence that would eventually provide the justice she deserved. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my nursing career. By the third week, Marcus's condition had deteriorated significantly. His new liver was failing rapidly, much faster than a typical rejection case. His hepatitis C viral load was climbing exponentially, confirming that the infection was progressing aggressively in his immunosuppressed state. Dr. Ashford ordered more aggressive anti-rejection medications, knowing they would further compromise Marcus's ability to fight the hepatitis C infection. She was essentially poisoning him twice, once with the contaminated organ, and again with medications that would make the infection more deadly. Carter was struggling with the psychological burden of our plan. "We're watching him die, Sarah," he said to me one evening as we reviewed Marcus's declining lab results. "We know what's killing him, and we're not doing anything to stop it." I understood his anguish, but I also understood the bigger picture. "If we expose this now," I told him, "Ashford will claim it was an honest mistake, a system error, a tragic accident. She'll get a slap on the wrist, and next month she'll do this to someone else. But if we wait, if we let this play out and document everything, we'll have her dead to rights for premeditated murder." The fourth week brought the crisis we had been anticipating. Marcus developed acute hepatic failure, his new liver completely overwhelmed by the hepatitis C infection. His skin turned yellow again, his mind became confused from hepatic encephalopathy, and his body began retaining fluid as his liver stopped performing basic metabolic functions. Maria was beside herself with grief and confusion. "I don't understand," she sobbed to Dr. Ashford. "You said the surgery was successful. You said he was doing well. How can he be dying again?" Dr. Ashford's response was a masterclass in medical gaslighting. She explained to Maria that organ rejection was always a risk, that sometimes transplanted organs failed despite everyone's best efforts, and that they were doing everything possible to save Marcus. She never mentioned hepatitis C, never suggested that the donor organ might have been contaminated, never admitted that Marcus was dying from a disease she had knowingly given him. Instead, she painted his death as a tragic but unavoidable complication of transplant surgery. I watched Dr. Ashford manipulate a grieving family while their husband and father died from her deliberate actions, and I felt my resolve harden into something unbreakable. This woman had to be stopped, not just for Marcus Thompson, but for every future patient who would suffer if she continued practicing medicine. The evidence we were collecting would ensure that she never had the opportunity to kill again. Marcus Thompson died on a Friday morning in April, exactly 1 month and 3 days after receiving his contaminated liver transplant. His death was as peaceful as we could make it, surrounded by his family and with appropriate palliative care to minimize his suffering. Maria held his hand as he passed, whispering words of love in both English and Spanish, telling him how proud she was of his strength and how much his children loved him. Dr. Ashford was notably absent from his final moments, claiming she had an emergency surgery that required her attention. The official cause of death listed on Marcus Thompson's death certificate was acute hepatic failure secondary to organ rejection. No mention of hepatitis C, no indication that the transplanted organ had been contaminated. No suggestion that his death was anything other than a tragic complication of an otherwise successful surgery. Dr. Ashford had successfully covered her tracks, or so she thought. She had committed the perfect murder, disguised as medical misfortune. But Dr. Ashford had made one crucial mistake in her arrogance. She had assumed that no one would challenge her diagnosis or demand additional investigation into Marcus's death. She had forgotten that families have rights, that medical procedures have protocols, and that sometimes a determined nurse knows exactly how to use both to expose the truth. The day after Marcus died, I had a long conversation with Maria Thompson about autopsy rights and the importance of understanding exactly what had caused her husband's death. "Mrs. Thompson," I said carefully, "I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I want you to know that you have the right to request an autopsy to determine the exact cause of Marcus's death. Sometimes these procedures can provide answers that help other families in similar situations." Maria looked at me with exhausted eyes. Would it help other people? Would understanding what happened to Marcus help other patients? I nodded solemnly. "It might, Mrs. Thompson. It really might." The autopsy request was submitted on Monday morning, 4 days after Marcus's death. Dr. Ashford tried to discourage it, telling Maria that autopsies were traumatic for families and rarely provided information that changed anything. She suggested that Marcus's death was straightforward, organ rejection leading to liver failure, and that an autopsy would only prolong the family's grief. But Maria Thompson had found strength in the possibility that her husband's death might help others, and she insisted on the procedure. Dr. Ashford couldn't legally prevent the autopsy without raising suspicions, so she did the next best thing. She tried to influence the pathologist's findings. I watched her have several private conversations with Dr. Richardson, the chief pathologist, discussions that took place behind closed doors and involved a lot of animated gesturing from Ashford. She was clearly trying to frame the narrative before the autopsy was even performed, suggesting what the pathologist should look for and what conclusions should be drawn. But Dr. Richardson was thorough and professional, and autopsy findings don't lie. When the results came back 2 weeks later, they told the complete and devastating truth about Marcus Thompson's death. The autopsy showed clear evidence of acute hepatitis C infection in the transplanted liver, with viral markers that matched the original donor's blood work. Most damning of all, genetic sequencing of the virus proved that Marcus had been infected with hepatitis C from the donor organ itself. There was no other possible source for the infection. The autopsy report was a smoking gun that could not be explained away or dismissed. It proved definitively that Marcus Thompson had died from hepatitis C transmitted through his liver transplant, and that the infection had been present in the donor organ from the beginning. Combined with Carter's documentation of the deleted test results and my detailed timeline of Dr. Ashford's actions, we had built an absolutely irrefutable case of premeditated medical murder. Now came the moment I had been planning for over a month. The moment when Dr. Evelyn Ashford's carefully constructed world would come crashing down around her. I spent an entire weekend crafting the most important email I would ever write. One that would end a murderer's career and potentially save countless lives. The subject line was simple and direct. Evidence of deliberate medical malpractice resulting in patient death. Immediate investigation required. The body of the email was a masterpiece of clinical documentation and righteous fury. I detailed every aspect of Dr. Ashford's crime, from her deletion of the hepatitis C test results, to her manipulation of the waiting list, to her false reassurances to the Thompson family. I attached Carter's original donor report showing the hepatitis C positive result, the autopsy report proving Marcus died from the infection, and my detailed timeline showing Ashford's knowledge and intent. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but the most important part of the email was the recipient list. I didn't just send it to one person who might be compromised or intimidated. I sent it to everyone who had the power and responsibility to act. The hospital's board of directors, the state medical board, the Organ Procurement Network Oversight Committee, the district attorney's office, and the local FBI field office. I even sent copies to investigative journalists at 3 major newspapers, knowing that public exposure would make it impossible for anyone to bury the evidence. The subject line of that email appeared in 47 inboxes at exactly 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Marcus Thompson's autopsy results were finalized. By 9:15 a.m., my phone was ringing nonstop with calls from administrators, investigators, and reporters. By 10 a.m., Dr. Ashford had been suspended from all surgical duties pending investigation. By noon, FBI agents were on site collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. By 5 p.m., the story was breaking on local news stations across the city. The collapse of Dr. Evelyn Ashford's empire was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours of my email being sent, she had been arrested on charges of voluntary manslaughter, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The FBI investigation revealed additional cases of waiting list manipulation, falsified medical records, and preferential treatment for wealthy patients. The hospital board that had protected her for so long suddenly couldn't distance themselves fast enough from their former golden goose. Richard Blackstone, the billionaire who had ultimately received Marcus Thompson's healthy liver, found himself at the center of a federal investigation into healthcare corruption. His $50 million donation was frozen pending determination of whether it constituted bribery, and his own medical records were subpoenaed to determine if he had knowledge of the preferential treatment he received. The man who thought his money could buy him a place at the front of the line discovered that it had actually bought him a front-row seat to a criminal trial. The media coverage was extensive and devastating for everyone involved. "Surgeon accused of murder to benefit wealthy donor" was the headline that appeared on front pages across the country. Dr. Ashford's carefully cultivated reputation as a medical genius was replaced overnight by her new identity as a cold-blooded killer who had betrayed the most sacred trust in healthcare. Her previous patients began coming forward with questions about their own surgeries, wondering if they too had been victims of her corruption. Carter and I were hailed as whistleblowers and heroes, but the recognition felt hollow. We had successfully exposed a murderer and prevented future victims. But Marcus Thompson was still dead. His 3 children would still grow up without their father. Maria would still face widowhood and single parenthood. And a good man had still died from the deliberate actions of someone who had sworn to first do no harm. Justice had been served. But justice couldn't bring back the dead. The trial lasted 6 months and became a media sensation that riveted the entire healthcare industry. Prosecutor after prosecutor took the stand to present evidence of Dr. Ashford's crimes, painting a picture of systematic corruption and callous disregard for human life. Carter testified about discovering the deleted hepatitis C results, and Dr. Ashford's falsification of donor records. I testified about the timeline of events and the detailed documentation we had compiled. The autopsy results were presented as the final proof of Marcus's cause of death. Dr. Ashford's defense team tried every possible strategy to save her. They claimed the deletion of test results was a computer error, that the hepatitis C infection was a rare post-transplant complication, that Marcus would have died anyway from his original liver disease. They painted her as a dedicated surgeon who had made difficult decisions under pressure, a victim of a healthcare system that forced doctors to make impossible choices. But the evidence was too strong, the documentation too detailed, and the timeline too clear for any reasonable doubt to exist. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Dr. Evelyn Ashford, once considered one of the most talented transplant surgeons in the world, was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the premeditated murder of Marcus Thompson. Her medical license was permanently revoked, her assets were frozen to pay restitution to the Thompson family, and her name became synonymous with medical corruption and the abuse of power. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal came during victim impact statements at Ashford's sentencing hearing. Maria Thompson stood at the podium, looked directly at the woman who had murdered her husband, and spoke with a dignity and strength that brought tears to everyone in the courtroom. "You took my husband away from his children who needed him," she said. "You stole years of love and laughter and family memories because you thought a rich man's life was worth more than a poor man's life. You forgot that every patient is someone's father, someone's husband, someone's hero. Marcus was my hero, and you killed him for money." The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Dr. Ashford's conviction. Metropolitan General Hospital faced a federal investigation that resulted in the resignation of its board of directors and a complete overhaul of its transplant protocols. New oversight measures were implemented across the entire organ donation network to prevent similar manipulation. Medical schools began requiring additional ethics training focused specifically on the temptations and corruptions that can arise when healthcare meets wealth and power. Carter completed his residency and went on to specialize in medical ethics, becoming a leading advocate for transparency and accountability in healthcare. He never forgot the lesson he learned that night when he discovered the deleted test results, that sometimes doing the right thing requires incredible courage and a willingness to stand up to people who seem untouchable. His experience with the Ashford case shaped his entire career and made him a powerful voice for reform in the medical profession. As for me, I remained in the transplant ICU at Metropolitan General, continuing to care for patients and their families during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. But I was changed by the experience of watching Marcus Thompson die, and knowing that I could have tried to save him, but chose instead to let him become a martyr for a greater cause. I carried the weight of that decision every day, but I also carried the knowledge that dozens of other patients were alive because we had stopped Dr. Ashford from killing again. The Thompson family used their wrongful death settlement to establish a foundation focused on healthcare transparency and patient advocacy. Marcus's children grew up knowing that their father's death had meaning, that his sacrifice had prevented other families from suffering the same loss. Maria remarried eventually, but she never stopped fighting for healthcare reform, and never stopped telling Marcus's story to anyone who would listen. Before we end this story, I want you to understand something important about healthcare and the people who control it. Medical professionals hold incredible power over life and death, and most of them use that power responsibly and ethically, but some don't. Some get corrupted by money, by prestige, by the God complex that comes from literally holding lives in your hands. And when those people fall to corruption, they become incredibly dangerous because they're protected by a system that doesn't want to believe doctors can be killers. If you're watching this story and thinking it could never happen at your hospital, in your city, with your doctors, think again. Medical corruption exists everywhere. There's big money and life or death decisions. Patients die every day from preventable causes, while wealthy donors get preferential treatment. The only thing that stops it is people like Carter and me who are willing to speak up, document everything, and fight back against a system that protects the corrupt and abandons the vulnerable. First CTA, subscribe to Hospital Revenge. If stories like this make you angry, if you believe that healthcare should be about saving lives rather than generating profits, then you need to subscribe to Hospital Revenge. This channel is dedicated to exposing the corruption, the cover-ups, and the battles that happen every day in hospitals across the country. We tell the stories that hospital administrators don't want you to hear, And we honor the memory of patients who died because someone decided their lives weren't worth as much as a wealthy donor's convenience. Hit that subscribe button and join our fight against a system that's forgotten what healthcare is supposed to be about. Dr. Ashford is currently serving her sentence at Albion Correctional Facility in New York, where she spends her days in a 6-by-8-foot cell instead of a luxury operating room. She's appealed her conviction twice, and both appeals have been denied. The woman who once commanded the respect and fear of an entire hospital now spends her time in prison laundry duty, her surgical skills worthless and her reputation destroyed forever. She's eligible for parole in 2041, when she'll be 76 years old, assuming she lives that long. Richard Blackstone eventually pled guilty to federal bribery charges and served 18 months in minimum security prison. His liver transplant was successful, and he's alive today, a fact that makes Marcus Thompson's death even more tragic. Blackstone lost his business empire and most of his fortune to legal fees and restitution payments, but he kept his life, the life that cost Marcus Thompson everything. He's never publicly acknowledged his role in what happened, never apologized to the Thompson family, never showed any remorse for the chain of events his corruption set in motion. The liver that Marcus Thompson should have received, the healthy, uncontaminated organ that Dr. Ashford saved for Blackstone, functioned perfectly and gave the billionaire 15 additional years of life and counting. Every birthday Blackstone celebrates is a reminder of the birthday Marcus Thompson will never have. Every holiday he spends with his family is a holiday the Thompson children spend missing their father. The mathematics of medical corruption are always calculated in human lives, and the ledger never balances. But here's what Dr. Ashford never understood in her arrogance, and Dr. Blackstone never grasped in his entitlement. Some people can't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. Some people believe that every life has equal value regardless of bank account balances or social connections, and sometimes those people are willing to watch a tragedy unfold so they can prevent an even greater evil from continuing. Second CTA, engagement question. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you respond in the comments. If you had been in my position that night when Carter told me about the contaminated liver, what would you have done? Would you have tried to stop the surgery, knowing it probably wouldn't work and would just alert Ashford to cover her tracks better? Or would you have done what we did? Let Marcus Thompson die so we could gather the evidence needed to stop Ashford from killing anyone else. It's an impossible choice, and there's no right answer, but I want to know what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like button if this story made you think about the real cost of corruption in healthcare. The investigation into Dr. Ashford's practices uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond just one contaminated liver transplant. Federal investigators discovered that she had been manipulating organ allocation for over 5 years, accepting bribes disguised as research donations, and systematically favoring wealthy patients over those who were medically more critical. The FBI found evidence of at least 12 other cases where she had bent or broken protocols to benefit donors who had made substantial financial contributions to the hospital. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a private spreadsheet found on Dr. Ashford's personal laptop that listed patients by their insurance coverage, net worth, and donation potential. Marcus Thompson was listed in the negligible value category, while Richard Blackstone was marked as maximum priority, major donor. The spreadsheet showed that she had been treating human lives like commodities for years, assigning monetary values to people who trusted her with their most precious possession, their chance to live. The forensic accounting investigation revealed that Dr. Ashford had received over $2 million in consulting fees and research grants from wealthy patients and their families over the previous 3 years. These payments were carefully disguised as legitimate medical expenses, but the timing always coincided with favorable treatment decisions and expedited transplant procedures. She had essentially been running an auction house for organs, selling life-saving medical care to the highest bidder while letting poorer patients die on waiting lists. What made Dr. Ashford's crimes even more heinous was the discovery that she had been keeping detailed records of her corruption, apparently proud of her ability to manipulate the system. Investigators found emails where she bragged to colleagues about her creative patient management strategies and her ability to optimize outcomes for key stakeholders. She had turned healing into a business transaction and had been documenting her success like a corporate executive tracking quarterly profits. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of her pre-sentencing investigation painted a picture of someone who had completely lost touch with the ethical foundations of medicine. Dr. Ashford showed no remorse for her actions, no empathy for her victims, and no understanding of why her behavior was considered criminal. She repeatedly insisted that she was simply being pragmatic about resource allocation and that her wealthy patients deserve preferential treatment because they contributed more to society and to medical research funding. During one particularly chilling interview with federal investigators, Dr. Ashford was asked about Marcus Thompson specifically. Her response was recorded and later played during her sentencing hearing. Mr. Thompson was going to die anyway. His prognosis was poor, his compliance with post-transplant protocols was questionable, and his family lacked the resources to support optimal recovery outcomes. Mr. Blackstone, on the other hand, had excellent long-term survival potential and the means to ensure proper follow-up care. From a medical standpoint, it was simply a matter of allocating a scarce resource to the patient most likely to benefit from it. That statement revealed everything you need to know about how Dr. Ashford viewed her patients and her role as a physician. She had convinced herself that she was making rational medical decisions when she was actually committing premeditated murder for financial gain. The woman who had sworn to first do no harm had become someone who calculated harm like a business expense, acceptable as long as the profit margins were high enough. The trial testimony from other nurses and medical staff painted a picture of a hospital culture where Dr. Ashford's corruption was an open secret that no one felt powerful enough to challenge. Nurses whispered about suspicious patient transfers and unexplained changes in treatment protocols, but the hospital administration had made it clear that questioning Dr. Ashford's decisions was a career-ending move. She had surrounded herself with a wall of institutional protection that made her feel invincible right up until the moment my email appeared in those 47 inboxes. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Dr. Patricia Martinez, a former resident who had worked under Dr. Ashford, testified about the toxic environment in the transplant department. Dr. Ashford made it clear that there were two types of patients, Martinez testified. There were the ones who mattered, the wealthy ones, the connected ones, the ones who could benefit the hospital financially. And then there were the others. The others were treated like medical practice dummies, cases to train residents on, obstacles to be managed rather than lives to be saved. She never said it explicitly, but the message was clear. Some lives are worth more than others. The defense team's strategy of portraying Dr. Ashford as a dedicated physician who had made difficult decisions under pressure completely collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence of her lavish lifestyle funded by her corruption. Bank records showed payments for luxury vacations, designer clothing, expensive jewelry, and a second home in the Hamptons, all purchased with money that could be directly traced to her illegal activities. She hadn't been making tough medical decisions. She had been profiting from human suffering. The most devastating testimony came from families of patients who had died while waiting for organs that went to wealthier, less critical patients. These families had spent months or years watching their loved ones deteriorate, hoping for a miracle that never came because Dr. Ashford had given their miracle to someone who could afford to buy it. The courtroom was filled with tears as parent after parent, spouse after spouse, child after child, described the agony of losing someone to a system that had abandoned them for profit. But perhaps the most important outcome of the trial wasn't Dr. Ashford's conviction. It was the systemic changes that resulted from the exposure of her crimes. The case became a catalyst for comprehensive healthcare reform, leading to new federal regulations governing organ allocation, mandatory transparency requirements for transplant programs, and criminal penalties for medical professionals who accept bribes disguised as donations. Marcus Thompson's death became the foundation for legislation that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Marcus Thompson Medical Ethics Act, passed by Congress 18 months after his death, established independent oversight boards for all organ transplant programs, required public reporting of organ allocation decisions, and created criminal penalties of up to life in prison for medical professionals who manipulate organ distribution for financial gain. The law also established a federal whistleblower protection program for healthcare workers who report corruption, ensuring that future nurses and residents like Carter and me would be protected when they chose to speak up against criminal behavior. Medical schools across the country began requiring mandatory courses on healthcare ethics and corruption prevention, using the Ashford case as a primary example of how brilliant physicians can become monsters when they lose sight of their fundamental mission. The case study of Marcus Thompson's murder is now taught in every medical ethics program in America, ensuring that future doctors understand the real-world consequences of prioritizing profit over patients. The Thompson family's foundation has grown into a national organization that monitors transplant programs, advocates for healthcare transparency, and provides support for families who have lost loved ones to medical corruption. Maria Thompson became a powerful voice for healthcare reform, testifying before congressional committees and speaking at medical conferences about the human cost of allowing money to influence life-and-death medical decisions. 5 years after Marcus Thompson's death, I received a letter from his oldest daughter, Isabella, who was graduating from college with a degree in pre-med. She wrote, "I'm going to become a doctor because of what happened to my father, but I'm going to be the kind of doctor he deserved. One who sees every patient as someone's father, someone's hero, someone whose life has infinite value regardless of their bank account. Thank you for making sure his death meant something. Thank you for getting justice for our dad." That letter reminded me why Carter and I made the decision we did that night when we learned about the contaminated liver. We couldn't save Marcus Thompson, but we could ensure that his death saved others. We could make sure that Dr. Ashford never had the opportunity to kill again, and we could expose a system of corruption that was literally trading human lives for financial contributions. Sometimes the only way to stop a greater evil is to allow a terrible tragedy to unfold, so you can document it thoroughly enough to prevent future tragedies. Dr. Ashford's conviction sent shockwaves through the medical community and served notice that healthcare corruption would no longer be tolerated or covered up. Hospitals across the country implemented new oversight procedures. Medical professionals began reporting suspicious behavior more frequently, and patients gained new protections against discrimination based on their financial status. The culture of silence that had protected corrupt physicians for decades was finally broken. But the most important lesson from this case isn't about medical corruption or healthcare reform. It's about the power of ordinary people to fight back against systems that seem too big and too powerful to challenge. Carter was just a resident. I was just a nurse. And Marcus Thompson was just a construction worker from Queens. None of us had wealth or political connections or institutional power. But we had something more valuable: the determination to document the truth and the courage to fight for justice even when the odds seemed impossible. The night Carter came to me with news of the contaminated liver, we faced a choice that no one should ever have to make. We could try to save one man and probably fail, alerting a killer to be more careful in the future, or we could sacrifice that man to build an ironclad case that would save countless others. It was a devil's bargain, a choice between certain injustice and possible prevention of future injustices. We chose justice over mercy, and we've lived with that decision every day since. Final CTA, channel engagement. This is what real revenge looks like. Not hot anger or impulsive action, but cold calculation and systematic documentation that builds an unbeatable case for justice. If you want to hear more stories about people who fought back against corrupt systems and won, if you want to understand how ordinary individuals can take down seemingly untouchable institutions, then you need to subscribe to Hospital Revenge and hit that notification bell. Like this video if you believe that healthcare should be about saving lives, not generating profits. Share it if you think more people need to understand how corruption works in medical settings. And leave a comment answering this question. What's more important in a doctor? Incredible surgical skill or unshakable ethics? Can you have one without the other, or are both equally essential? Marcus Thompson has been dead for 7 years now, but his story continues to save lives every day through the reforms his death inspired and the corruption his murder exposed. Dr. Evelyn Ashford will spend the rest of her life in prison, a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliant people lose their moral compass. Richard Blackstone lives with the knowledge that his life was purchased with another man's death, a burden that all his remaining wealth can't erase. And I continue working in the transplant ICU at Metropolitan General, caring for patients and families who have no idea that their safety is partly protected by the sacrifice of a construction worker from Queens, who died so that others might live. Every successful transplant, every life saved, every family reunion made possible by ethical medical care is a monument to Marcus Thompson's memory and a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most heartbreaking defeats. The truth is that Marcus Thompson died twice, once from the contaminated liver that Dr. Ashford knowingly gave him, and once more when Carter and I made the decision to let it happen so we could document the crime. But his death also gave birth to something powerful, a system where corruption can't hide, where money can't buy preferential treatment, and where the Marcus Thompsons of the world have the same chance at life as the Richard Blackstones. That's not a perfect justice, but it's the only justice we could create from an impossible situation. In the end, this story isn't really about medical corruption or hospital politics or even revenge. It's about the value of human life and who gets to decide what that value is. Dr. Ashford believed she had the right to make those calculations, to weigh one life against another based on financial contribution and social status. She was wrong, and she paid for that error with her freedom, her reputation, and her legacy. Marcus Thompson's life had infinite value, just like every patient who trusts their life to medical professionals, and that value doesn't decrease based on insurance coverage or bank account balances. The next time you or someone you love needs medical care, remember Marcus Thompson's story. Ask questions, demand transparency, and never accept the idea that some patients are more deserving of life-saving treatment than others. The system that killed Marcus Thompson still exists in hospitals across the country, but it's weaker now because people are watching. People are asking questions, and people like Carter and me are ready to document everything when corruption shows its face. Healthcare corruption thrives in darkness and dies in sunlight. Marcus Thompson's death turned on the lights, and we're never letting them go out again.